At the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad on May 10, 1869, a last spike ceremony was held in the isolated wilderness of Promontory Summit in Utah. In those days of the rapid growth of the railroads across the country, the tradition was to celebrate the completion of a new route by having one or more of the owners drive the last spike into the railroad tie that joined the two rails. So it was on that day in May that Leland Stanford raised the special silver-plated maul that drove the last spike on the railroad that united the nation. The spike, which was made of 17-karat gold, is now on display at the Cantor Arts Center at Stanford University in California. The site of this historic event is well preserved at the Golden Spike National Historic Park at Promontory Summit, Utah. The idea of having a special dedication ceremony for a major product completion was not new, and is similar to the ceremonies of today that open new highways, buildings, and dedicate new ships. However, there is one last spike ceremony that almost did not take place, and even then was an afterthought, probably being more significant to those who had done the back-breaking labor to build the railroad than to those who financed it. This is the story of the search for the symbolic last spike that signaled the completion of the San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake Railroad. Unlike its more famous predecessor at Promontory Summit, this spike was just an ordinary iron railroad spike, and neither its whereabouts nor the exact location of the site is known. For many years after Nevada joined the Union, the southern portion of the state was deemed to be a harsh and cruel desert that was a challenge to pass through on the way to Los Angeles to the south and Salt Lake City to the north. In 1826, Jedediah Smith passed near Las Vegas on the Arizona side of the Colorado River on his way to Los Angeles. Antonio Armijo in 1829 was the first non-Native American to pass through the southeastern edge of the valley as he established a trade route from Santa Fe to Los Angeles. John C. Fremont, on his return to the east from his expedition of 1844, crossed the Las Vegas Valley and documented the free-flowing springs that later became the main source of water. Finally, in 1855, the Mormons arrived and built a fort-like settlement, cleared the ground, and planted hay, fruits, and vegetables. 2 years later, they abandoned the fort. Several years later, Octavius Gass purchased the rights to the old fort and established the first permanent ranch in the valley. He lost the ranch in 1881 to Archibald Stewart, who, after occupying the ranch for a short time, was gunned down in a dispute with a neighboring rancher. His wife, Helen Stewart, bravely stayed on, raised her children, and prospered. She eventually owned 1,800 acres of land, which included the present downtown Las Vegas and the Big Springs, which again was the major water supply for Las Vegas Valley. During most of this time, there were only 3 ranches in the area and only 20 people listed on the census. Then in 1902, she was convinced to sell her ranch to the infamous William Andrew Clark, who wanted to build a railroad through the area and needed the Stewart Ranch with its water rights for one of the divisions of his railroad. An equally ambitious Edward Henry Harriman had the same idea of building a railroad to connect Salt Lake City and the city of Los Angeles. He had acquired railroad interests in Utah and Oregon and was proceeding south into Nevada at the same time that Clark was building railroad beds as well. Both sides became embroiled in reciprocal lawsuits, and the progress on the railroad was stalled. Finally, they reached an agreement whereby Harriman would give up all of his claims and railroad beds in exchange for 50% of the Clark Railroad stock. With the feuding now settled, the work to complete Clark's railroad went full steam ahead. On January 30th, 1905, the crews working north from California and those moving south from Utah met at a site between Las Vegas, Nevada, and Jean, Nevada. Everyone expected this to be a big moment, with all of the fanfare of a golden spike ceremony. But this was not to be. For some reason, the chief engineer, E.G. Tilton, balked at having any type of last spike celebration. Clark, who was still a U.S. Senator, seemed not to care, as he was not present, and neither was his brother, J. Ross Clark, who was busy in New York. Harriman was no longer involved directly in the building of the railroad. If it were not for the account of the Los Angeles Times reporter Harry C. Carr, we might never have known what took place. According to Carr, the last spike was made of simply Pittsburgh pig iron and was unceremoniously hammered into place near railroad siding number 31 by his quote, bullet-headed Greek at approximately 3:15 in the afternoon. Immediately thereafter, cheers went up from the Greeks and Austrians on the Nevada side of the track and the Mexicans who had laid the track north from California. If it were not for the wife of General Manager Wells, that would have been it. When she heard that there was not going to be a Golden Spike celebration, she was so upset that she had a tiny gold spike about the size of a man's thumbnail made and sent it from Los Angeles with one of the trains to be placed on the railroad tie by Chief Engineer Tilton. After the last spike was driven, Tilton rather sheepishly reached into his vest pocket, retrieved the token spike, and pushed it into the last railroad tie. Unlike the ceremony at Promontory Summit, where the first railroad car to cross the junction was full of dignitaries, the first machine to cross this junction was one of the Harris track-laying cars. Tilton then removed the tiny golden spike and returned it to Mrs. Wells. Since no one thought to place a permanent marker at that time, the actual site of the Nevada last spike has faded from memory, never to be found again. So, what happened to this last spike, and where was it driven into that last railroad tie? Short answer, no one knows for sure. Two possible sites have been established as the locations of the last spike. First, the Nevada state marker number 195 is found just north of the railroad bridge when coming from the direction of Jean, Nevada along Highway 91. According to the State Historical Preservation Office, or SHPO, near this site, workers drove the last spike that completed the railroad from Salt Lake City, Utah, and Los Angeles, California. SHPO is known for being painstakingly accurate in its research. The only problem in this case is that the statement "near the site" is too vague and could indicate anywhere west of the marker, near the railroad tracks, and between Jean and Las Vegas. If that was their intention, then so be it. But for the meticulous amateur historian, this description leaves a lot to be desired. In close proximity to the state marker is that bridge which was mentioned, with the highway going under it and the bridge on and the train on top. This is a considerable curve in the track at this point, and it's unlikely that the spike would have been placed on a curve like that rather than a straightaway. It also does not match Carr's description of the view from the spike. Myrick states that the rails were joined at the entrance to a deep cut near siding number 31. This would seem to possibly place the exact site of the last spike closer to the SHPO sign. SHPO was contacted by mail and kindly provided an old map with markings that they had placed, which indicated the actual proposed site of the last spike. About a mile north and east of the SHPO marker is a sign near the railroad tracks that was likely placed by the Union Pacific Railroad Company. It states that somewhere in the proximity of the sign is the site of the last spike. Again, no precise location is given. The large letters and the elevation of this sign suggest that it was placed there for the engineers on passing trains to see. An email reply from the Union Pacific Museum curator, however, indicated that the exact location of the last spike is not known to them and that we should perhaps go along with the SHPO sign. So what is a person to believe? I have come to the conclusion that the most likely location where the last spike was hammered into place was at or very near the Union Pacific sign. The evidence is as follows. Myrick states that the site was confirmed in 1914 by a roadmaster who pointed out to an ICC, Interstate Commerce, inspector the spot where the California Redwood ties from the California crew met the Oregon Pine Railroad ties from the Utah crew. This same spot coincided with Engineer Station 7954, which, according to Myrick, is located 1,654 feet east of the back wall of the culvert at milepost number 305.98. The site was a short distance east of the east switch of siding number 31, or the Sutor siding, which was removed in 1948. I found the culvert mentioned by Myrick, and a sign documents that it is at milepost 305.98. Using Google Earth, a line drawn from as close to the back wall of the culvert as could be approximated and extending 1,654 feet to the northeast, ends very close to that Union Pacific sign. John Signor, in his book, quotes Tilton's message to headquarters after the last spike was driven. And I quote, "Rails join today between east and west ends of the track at 3:15 p.m. at Station G, 7954." End of quote. This matches perfectly with the Myrick location. It would have been very helpful to have had the location of the east switch of the siding number 31 as an additional check on that location. Finally, on January 30th, 1975, during a special ceremony near Jean, Nevada, SHPO unveiled its historic marker near the site of the last spike. The brief mention of this event in the Las Vegas Review-Journal stated that the actual site was at milepost 306.29, which is consistent with the Union Pacific Railroad sign mentioned by Myrick and Signor and Tilton. So for now, the site of the last spike is established as being at or very close to the Union Pacific sign. The present state marker, number 195, might have been purposely placed in its present position to give a panoramic view of the area and to make it more accessible to motor vehicles. Also, there are likely safety reasons. This site would serve to keep the general public from roaming too close to the railroad tracks and trespassing on Union Pacific property. At least the state marker preserves the memory of the event. And even though there is no benchmark drilled into the ground precisely establishing the site of the last spike, and there is no modern Park Service museum dedicated to the construction of the San Pedro, Los Angeles and Salt Lake Railroad nearby, rest assured that Nevada does have its own last spike. It was the coming of the railroad that gave birth to the city of Las Vegas and transformed the stark, isolated desert valley into the shining metropolis that it is today. This is the Nevada State historical marker, number 195, which was placed here to designate the area where the last spike in the San Pedro, Los Angeles, Salt Lake Railroad was laid. This railroad extended from, of course, San Pedro, California, all the way to Salt Lake City. Its importance is that it used Las Vegas as sort of a halfway point. And it essentially set off Las Vegas as an important place along what used to be just the old Mormon Trail and the old Highway 91. Now, there were two companies competing to put the railroad through. Their aim was to connect the two cities for purposes of trade. There were goods coming into San Pedro Harbor in California that could be shipped to Salt Lake City, and at Ogden there was a hookup with the Transcontinental Railroad. So this meant that California produce and anything shipped from the Pacific could make its way back east. Also, there were several mining operations going on in southern Nevada at that time, and the railroad people knew that they would be the ones to ship the ore out of the mines and to market. So after competing with each other, one building from Utah, the Oregon Short Line, and then the San Pedro, Las Vegas, Salt Lake train under William A. Clark, who Clark County is named for, came from California. They finally, after fighting and lots of court battles, finally decided to make a deal. And the deal was that the short line under Harriman, the Oregon Short Line Company, would get 50% of the stock in the railroad. And in turn, he would turn over the track that he had laid to William A. Clark. And that settled it. So somewhere along here, the last spike was laid on January 30th, 1905. The problem is, this may not be near the site of the last spike, because when you look on Google Maps, you find that there are two places mentioned as Golden Spike. And if you read Myrick's book, which is essentially the authority on railroads in Nevada, they actually place the area of the last spike further up this road towards the Seven Magic Mountains. And there used to be a sign that the engineers could see as they passed by, designating that area as the area of the last spike. So what we'll have to do is go up to that area, find the turnoff, and then see if there's any remnant of the sign that used to be there. But from all that I can gain from this, that is the actual site further up and not here. This is just a general designation of where the last spike was placed. So now we have a problem to solve. Is this where the actual spike was placed? Or was it placed closer to where the state marker 195 is, about 1.25 miles down the road? And I really don't think anybody knows. But obviously this roadbed here has been replace. These rocks look all new, and the rails are probably new, and I'm sure the railroad ties don't date back to 1905. And I don't see any golden spikes here. Let's get up opposite the sign and see if they've etched anything in here. And I certainly don't see the lady's little golden spike. Well, it always makes you wonder when you see a spike like this sticking up, if the rails are still being held properly in place. But I see several areas where there's only one spike, like right next to it. That's Interstate 15 heading towards Las Vegas in this direction. And all they had to do here was lay straight track. I just had a thought. If this train were to derail, me and my vehicle would be toast. And buried under one of those or several of those cargo containers. That was a long one. So you can see the importance of transporting goods from Utah down to California and vice versa. And notice, no caboose. It's all done electronically now. Well, that was a pleasant surprise to actually see the train